the envelope is already in your hands. That is the part no one tells you, that the most devastating things you will ever do in your life will not feel devastating in the moment you do them. They will feel reasonable, logical, even. You are standing in a narrow hallway in Bern, Switzerland, in the spring of 1905, and the man who just handed you the envelope did not look at you for more than a second before he turned back to his desk and picked up his pen again. He is 26 years old. His jacket is slightly too large for him, and his hair is already wild in a way that suggests he has never once thought about his hair. And he works 6 days a week in this patent office reviewing other people's ideas while his own ideas collect inside him like water behind a dam. His name is Albert Einstein, and the envelope you are holding contains 4 scientific papers that, if they reach their destination, will permanently fracture the way the human species understands the universe. You know this. You came here knowing this. And yet, you hold the envelope, and the envelope is just paper, and the paper is just weight, and for a long and terrible second the weight feels like nothing at all. You do not open it. You simply do not deliver it. That is all it takes. One withheld action, one unremarkable moment of passive refusal, and the 4 papers that would have redefined mass, energy, space, and time remain unread, unreviewed, unpublished, and eventually lost to the quiet indifference of an archive no one will search because no one will know what to search for. You tell yourself this is a small thing. You tell yourself that ideas this large cannot be contained, that someone else will find them, that the universe does not need a single man to decode it. You tell yourself this as you walk out of the building and into the street where the light is ordinary and the shadows fall at the angles you have always expected them to fall. And for a moment, just a moment, everything seems fine. The city breathes around you. The clocks tick. The trams move on their rails. And you have absolutely no idea what you have just done. The first thing that disappears is so subtle you would never notice it. It is not an explosion, not a collapse, not a visible rupture in anything. It is a silence, a negative space where a particular kind of thinking should have been. In the years that follow your intervention, the physicists who might have built upon Einstein's work continue building upon the frameworks that already exist, the Newtonian architecture that has served science for 250 years and that, from the inside, still feels like a cathedral, vast and solid and seemingly without ceiling. They are not stupid men. Many of them are brilliant in ways that deserve their own histories, their own monuments. But they are working from a map that has an edge, and they do not know there is an edge, and so they move with increasing precision toward the boundary of what the map can describe. And when they reach it, they do not step across it because they do not know there is something to step across. The revolution does not fail. It simply never begins. By 1915, the world is still beautiful and still catastrophically dangerous, and the war that sweeps across Europe is not prevented by your interference. You were never operating under that delusion. Men still die in the mud of the Western Front by the millions. Empires still collapse under their own weight. The political upheavals that would have occurred regardless of what any physicist published continue to occur, because history at its largest scale moves on pressures that no single idea, however transformative, can entirely redirect. But what begins to shift, and this is where your interference starts to breathe, starts to expand, starts to take on a weight you did not expect, is the infrastructure beneath the infrastructure. The invisible skeleton that the 20th century would have used to build everything it was going to build is simply not there. The theoretical foundation for nuclear physics does not exist in its correct form. The understanding of how mass and energy relate to one another, not as distant cousins, but as the same thing wearing different clothes, has not been articulated, has not been proven, has not been absorbed into the scientific bloodstream of the era. And without that, certain doors remain not just closed, but unimagined. You will need to sit with this for a moment, because the absence of imagined doors is stranger and more total than anything you were prepared for. When a door is closed, there is still a door. There is still a handle, still a threshold, still a shape in the wall that signals possibility even in denial. But when the door was never built, when the wall is simply smooth and solid and unmarked, the people standing in front of it do not experience frustration. They experience nothing. They turn around. They find other walls to study. They become experts in walls that are actually ceilings, and they are proud of this expertise, and they are not wrong to be proud, because within the world they inhabit their expertise is real and functional and produces results. They simply never look up. You made it so that they could not look up, and you did it by holding an envelope in a hallway and burn for 30 seconds without moving your feet. The 1930s arrive, and with them the rise of the same political catastrophes that you remember, because some forces are older and darker and more durable than any equation, and Adolf Hitler's ascent to power in Germany proceeds on the schedule that hate and economic despair and the failure of institutional courage always produce. The physicists, who would have fled Germany under Einstein's precedent, the Jewish scientists, the political dissidents, the men and women who understood that the new regime did not intend to fund their curiosity but to weaponize or extinguish it, these people still flee, still scatter, still carry their intelligence across borders into Britain and America and wherever else a passport and a letter of reference can purchase safety. But they carry it into a different conversation. The theoretical scaffolding they would have worked within, the framework that made certain experiments not just possible but inevitable, is thinner here, less populated with the essential preconditions for the work that would have defined the next decade. Leo Szilard still thinks about chain reactions, because certain ideas have a gravity of their own, but the language he needs to think about them precisely is not available in the same form, and the thought moves more slowly through a medium that is not prepared to receive it. Here is where it becomes something other than an intellectual exercise. Here is where you have to stop thinking of your intervention as the removal of a single man from a single sequence of events and start thinking of it as the removal of a specific kind of clarity from a civilization at one of the most dangerous moments in its history. The physicists working in Germany in the late 1930s are also brilliant. They are also capable of pursuing nuclear fission with a determination that does not require Einstein's equations to sustain itself. Experimental reality has its own authority, and when uranium nuclei split and release energy, the release is measurable regardless of whether anyone has yet explained theoretically why the numbers are what they are. But the path toward a weapon, the engineering path, the path from observed phenomenon to deliverable catastrophe, is longer without the precise theoretical map that Einstein's work would have provided to everyone working in the field, including the people who would eventually race against each other to build what no one yet fully understood they were racing to build. The German program moves. It moves without the same theoretical acceleration. And somewhere in the difference between those two speeds, the actual speed and the speed that would have existed in a world where the envelope was delivered, an asymmetry begins to open, vast and dark and still widening. This is the part you cannot fully trace, because history without its key variables is not a story but a fog, and the fog is the point, and you have to learn to stand inside it without flinching. In the world you altered, what eventually becomes the Manhattan Project does not happen in the way it happened, not because the science is impossible, but because the concentration of theoretical understanding that made it happen in the span of a few years required a foundation that you removed. The war extends. Not forever, not infinitely, but it extends into configurations you cannot precisely predict, and neither can anyone else, because the variables are now different, and the outcomes branch in directions that are genuinely uncertain, genuinely unresolved. Hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost in specific ways are now not lost in those ways, but this is not the same as being saved. They are lost in other ways, in different numbers, under different flags, in battles that may have lasted years longer than they did, and in the silence between battles, where disease and famine and the slow administrative cruelty of extended wartime do their work without anyone cataloging them as casualties of the equations you never let anyone read. You should understand, by this point, that you have not made the world more peaceful. You have only made it differently violent. You have redistributed suffering in ways that no mathematics available to you, or to anyone in any timeline, can calculate with precision, and this is not because the suffering is less real but because the chains of causality have grown too long and too branched to follow with confidence. What you can say, with something approaching certainty, is this: the world into which the second half of the 20th century would have been born is architecturally different from the one that actually emerged. The Cold War, if it occurs at all in recognizable form, occurs without the particular terror of mutual nuclear annihilation that, paradoxically, brutally, in a way that only the most cold-eyed strategists ever said aloud, may have been the very thing that prevented a third world war between nuclear powers. The logic of deterrence is gone because the weapons that made deterrence necessary and possible are either absent or delayed or held by different hands in different proportions, and whatever replaces that logic is not clearly better or clearly worse. It is simply unknown, and the unknown is where all the worst things hide when you are not paying attention. By the 1960s, in the world you have made, the sky is the same sky. The stars are in their correct positions. The light from distant galaxies is still traveling toward instruments on mountaintops in California and Chile and Hawaii, and men in observatories still look at that light and wonder at its age and origin, because the universe does not need Einstein to be what it is, it only needed him to correctly describe it. But the descriptions available to the physicists and cosmologists of this altered century are less precise, less penetrating, built from frameworks that are still remarkably powerful but that carry inside them an unresolved wrongness that no one can quite locate because the tool that would have named the wrongness was never forged. The satellites that in another timeline would circle the Earth relying on relativistic corrections, corrections that without Einstein's theories no one would have known to make, are in this timeline gradually drifting wrong in ways that the engineers cannot explain and cannot correct because they do not know what they do not know, which is always the most dangerous kind of ignorance. Medical imaging technologies that depend on quantum mechanical principles are delayed by decades. Particle accelerators are built, but their theoretical framework is thinner, and certain experimental results that should have been anticipated arrive instead as shocks that set the entire field back by years, sometimes by an entire generation of researchers who spent their careers solving problems that should have already been solved. There is a strange grief that lives in the cultures of this altered world, and no one can name it because names require a contrast, and the contrast has been removed. The science fiction of this timeline is less visionary, not because its writers are less gifted but because the scientific imagination available to them, the palette of the genuinely possible and the genuinely speculated, is narrower, more earthbound, less drunk on the vertigo of what physics would have told them was permitted. The philosophy is different too, quieter in certain registers, because the destabilization that relativity introduced into the human understanding of simultaneity and causality and the nature of time itself, the genuine philosophical earthquake that accompanied the physics, never occurred, and the questions that earthquake would have forced thinkers to ask remain unasked, which means the answers, including some of the most profound answers the 20th century would have produced about the nature of reality and consciousness and the limits of human knowledge, also remain unspoken. You removed a paper from a hallway in Switzerland, and somewhere downstream a philosopher who would have written something essential is instead writing something merely good, and does not know the difference, and no one can tell him. There is a man somewhere in this altered world who is doing physics that is extraordinary by the standards available to him, and he does not know that his name should have been Feynman, or Heisenberg in a different mode, or any of the dozens of people whose work was built so completely on the foundation you removed that their contributions in your altered timeline are shadows of what they would have been. Not because they are less intelligent, but because intelligence is not free-floating. Because genius operates within a conversation, and the conversation you interrupted was one of the most generative in the history of science. This man does not know he is less than what he should have been. He does not feel the absence of the framework he was never given. He feels the specific pride of a person doing difficult work well within the constraints of the world as he finds it, and that feeling is genuine and human, and in no way false, and it changes nothing. The world is diminished and does not know it is diminished, and you are the only one who could make the comparison, and the comparison is unbearable. You have to ask yourself. You have to sit in whatever passes for stillness inside you and ask yourself what you thought you were doing. Not what you wanted, not what you feared, but what you believed, in the most honest chamber of your own reasoning, that you were actually doing when you held that envelope and did not move. Perhaps you believe that ideas this consequential should not belong to one man. Perhaps you believe that the splitting of the atom was a crime committed in advance by anyone who made it possible. Perhaps you simply could not hold in your mind simultaneously the beauty of what Einstein was about to give the world and the horror of what that gift would eventually be used to build, and in the space between those two things, beauty and horror, gift and weapon, you made a decision that was not really a decision, but a flinch. A very consequential flinch. A flinch that traveled forward through 100 years of human history like a crack moving through load-bearing stone. Slow at first, then faster, then everywhere at once, and now the building is not the building it was, and you are standing in it wondering which walls are still safe to lean against. The envelope contained 4 papers. In another spring, in another burn, they were delivered, they were read, they were published, and they changed the fundamental description of reality that science would use for the rest of recorded history. The special theory of relativity, the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, the equivalence of mass and energy. For papers from a 26-year-old patent clerk who worked 6 days a week reviewing other people's ideas and spent whatever was left imagining his own. He was not a saint. He was not a prophet. He was not the last man in the universe capable of extraordinary thought. He was simply the man who was there, in that hallway, in that spring, holding those papers, and you took them from him, and the world that follows is the world that follows, and it is yours now. This slower world, this differently damaged world, this world that is missing something it cannot name because the name for the missing thing was one of the things that went missing, and somewhere, in the smooth and unmarked wall where a door should have been, the universe continues to be exactly what it always was, patient and indifferent, waiting for someone to describe it correctly, waiting with the serenity of something that is all the time there is, because time, it turns out, does not actually care whether you understand it or not. The only question left is whether you do.